South Carolina's football program had a pretty good run in the 2023 NFL Draft, but 2024's group could be even better.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, your show for the latest headlines and potential storylines on South Carolina Gamecock athletics. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecocks Digest over on SI.com. Thank you for making Locked On Gamecocks your first watch or listen here today. We are free and available on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. And before we get into this Monday edition of Locked On Gamecocks, I do want to let y'all know that today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. South Carolina had a pretty good run in the 2023 NFL Draft as 5 Gamecocks in total were selected and drafted, and there's been a few others that have been signed as undrafted free agents. So while we're not going to break down the entirety of how South Carolina performed in the 2023 draft, we will talk about sort of how they've now gathered extra ammunition on the recruiting trail, both for in-state recruiting and on the defensive side of the ball in just a little bit. But first, let's talk about South Carolina's 2024 group, because while the 2023 group was a good one, South Carolina's group of prospects for the 2024 class could be even better. And it all starts with quarterback Spencer Rattler. Spencer Rattler has got a few things going for him that make him quite an impressionable NFL draft prospect. He's got experience in an offense that is full of pro-style concepts. Spencer Rattler is a quarterback that, unlike a lot of college quarterbacks nowadays, actually takes a lot of snaps from under center. He is a guy that has run a plethora of play-action concepts. And the other thing, which is usually the biggest learning curve for NFL rookies, is Spencer Rattler has experience running through multiple checks at the line of scrimmage before the ball is even snapped. I'll always say getting out 15 plus words when it comes to an actual play call. These are things that NFL franchises value, because the thing is, if you get a quarterback that does not have experience doing these kind of things, that's just more time for an NFL team that they're going to have to spend developing that prospect. Spencer Rattler is going to be ahead of a lot of his peers when it comes to this sort of thing. And the other thing is, Spencer Rattler has got a bunch of physical and positional qualities that NFL teams look for in modern-day quarterbacks. Firstly, Spencer Rattler has the ability to make throws off platform. And while this is not a requirement per se for your usual NFL starting quarterback, this is something now that you see with a lot of the top quarterbacks in the National Football League. And the best example, clearly, is Kansas City Chiefs franchise quarterback Patrick Mahomes, a guy that has now won 2 Super Bowls and I believe now 1 or 2 MVPs in the NFL, because of the fact that the guy could just flat out make throws that most human beings are not able to make. I'm not going to put Spencer Rattler on the same level as Patrick Mahomes, but I do think that Spencer Rattler, in terms of quarterbacks who can make throws off platform, is in that upper echelon. And again, that's something that's going to be valued a lot by NFL teams. Spencer Rattler's also got a quick release, which is something that when it comes to the NFL, with things happening within split seconds, is valuable for an NFL team, because obviously NFL defenses, they're going to blitz you a lot. They're going to bring a lot more cover zero blitzes. They're going to test your quarterback and their ability to be able to make timely decisions in just a matter of seconds. Spencer Rattler, again, he already has the experience in a pro-style heavy offense, but he's got the quick release to go along with that. In the NFL, facing the blitz, that's something that is going to be highly prioritized by certain teams. And he has shown that he can improve in terms of his pocket navigation. Spencer Rattler is by no means a finished product in that aspect, and that's something he'll have to continue to progress in this next season, but he got better in terms of being able to navigate all the traffic that was surrounding him throughout the 2022 season, especially obviously by season's end, where Spencer Rattler arguably was performing the best that he had in over a year, going back to his time with the Oklahoma Sooners. So Spencer Rattler is clearly number one on this list. At least, I think he is. But some might argue that this next guy is number one. And that prospect would be Antoine Juice Wells. Juice Wells, like Spencer Rattler, has got multiple things going for him here, heading into what likely is his final season in Columbia. Juice Wells has proven he could be a number one target in big games and also on the road. He, of course, recorded 11 receptions and 177 receiving yards against the Tennessee Volunteers. He recorded 9 catches for 131 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns on the road in South Carolina's upset win over the Clemson Tigers. He also had great road performances against teams like Arkansas and Kentucky. And the other thing is this, Juice has shown he could be quite reliable in terms of catching the football. Juice Wells was targeted 92 times in 2022 and only had 2 recorded drops, according to Pro Football Focus. That is a pretty good drop to target ratio right there for Antoine Juice Wells. And Juice Wells doesn't just reel in the football consistently. He's also a guy that can make things happen after the catch because, according to Pro Football Focus, Antoine Juice Wells ranked 7th nationally last season in total yards after the catch with 555. That accounts for over 50% of Antoine Juice Wells' receiving yards by season's end. Juice Wells was also tied for 11th nationally in missed tackles forced with 19. So Antoine Juice Wells, he has a lot of things going for him. He is a guy that will show up for you in big games and on the road. He is a guy that is going to catch the football. He's not going to have a major case of the dropsies in the NFL. He is somebody who is a threat after the catch. And also, I didn't even mention this, he's a guy that has a massive competitive fire that very few other players can match. So Antoine Juice Wells, for that reason, is number 2 in this list. Now, I got one more player that I want to discuss along with Spencer Rattler and Antoine Juice Wells, a guy from the defensive side of the ball that I think could have a breakout season this upcoming fall. We'll dive into who that player is in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Now, the NBA playoffs have officially arrived, and they've been going on for a little bit now, and there's been a lot of excitement. The Golden State Warriors went to 7 games against the Sacramento Kings and knocked them off yesterday afternoon. How about the Miami Heat defeating the Milwaukee Bucks as a number 8 seed? And they did it, I believe, in 5 games. The New York Knicks and Miami Heat are now facing off in the semifinals, reigniting the rivalry from the 90s. There's plenty of storylines to follow in the NBA playoffs this year. So right now, new customers on FanDuel can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. The Los Angeles Lakers are playing the Golden State Warriors in Game 1 of the Western Conference Semis on Tuesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The Lakers are a 5-point underdog according to FanDuel, and the money line for the Lakers is set at plus 166. If you think LeBron James and the Lakers have gotten enough rest, and they're going to be able to capitalize on that rest against the Warriors in Game 1, then drop some money on them to either cover their spread or win the game outright. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet, again, up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to this Monday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And thank you especially to all of you everydayers. If you want to become an everydayer of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, then you can feel free to subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, or give us a follow wherever you get your audio podcast daily. All right. The last prospect I want to talk about for South Carolina that could be a part of a special 2024 draft class is defensive tackle Tonka Hemingway. Tonka Hemingway, in my opinion, is going to slide right on into the role that Zacch Pickens has filled in for the last several years on South Carolina's defensive line. A hyper-athletic interior D lineman who can absolutely get after the quarterback in pass rush. Tonka Hemingway had an 82.1 pass rushing grade in 255 pass rush snaps this past season, according once again to Pro Football Focus. That was the 23rd best mark in the country for interior defensive linemen. And here's the thing, I mentioned Tonka Hemingway's hyper-athleticism. This guy was an all-state player on the hardwood for his basketball team, and he also played baseball in high school as well. Tonka Hemingway is a guy that is like Zacch Pickens, but in my opinion, he's got a higher baseline. Zacch Pickens, he was a very good player for South Carolina, no question about that. Guy that also was a very good athlete out of TL Hanna, and was somebody that really gave South Carolina a lot of juice in terms of compressing the pocket on the interior, especially on passing downs. If there's one critique that you could have with Zacch Pickens, it would be the fact that potentially he didn't have a wide array of pass rushing moves in his arsenal. He was a guy that relied a lot on his pure sheer strength in a bull rushing type move where he just basically stuck the interior offensive lineman and tried to just bulldoze his way to the quarterback. And there were times where, of course, this worked quite well for Zacch Pickens. But for Tonka Hemingway, he's got a little bit more than just a bull rush pass rushing move. He's got swim moves. He's got little hand swipe downs. He's a little bit better in terms of his hand work when he is rushing the quarterback. So with all that being said, Tonka Hemingway, in my opinion, right alongside Spencer Rattler and Antoine Juice Wells as the three best prospects for South Carolina in the 2024 NFL draft cycle. Now, of course, I've talked a lot about the 2024 draft cycle for South Carolina, but let's go back to the 2023 group real quick, because the results from this year's NFL draft have given Shane Beamer and this coaching staff more recruiting ammo when it comes to the state of South Carolina and also trying to recruit defensive backs. Think about this. South Carolina had 5 guys get drafted, the first 3 of which were Cam Smith, Zacch Pickens, and Darius Rush. Cam Smith was from Blythewood, South Carolina. Zacch Pickens was from Anderson, South Carolina. And Darius Rush was from Kingstree, South Carolina. For comparison, the Clemson Tigers only had 1 South Carolina native get drafted out of the 6 that they sent off to the NFL this past week. Why is this important? Well, obviously, South Carolina's coaching staff, when it comes to recruiting the best prospects in the Palmetto State now, can point to professional development, not just their relationships that they have with them or these high school programs, which obviously is very important. But we got to be honest with ourselves. At a certain point in time in Shane Beamer's tenure, prospects are going to start looking more towards the ability to develop their talents, to help mold them and get them ready for the next level, which is the NFL. It's going to happen at a certain point, and I think that you're already maybe starting to see that just a little bit, because South Carolina is now getting more involved in the game with really high-level prospects. And the thing that you got to convince these guys, along with you being the best fit for them as a coaching staff, schematically, academically, the other thing you got to prove to them is that you can develop these guys and you can get them ready for the next stage of their football career. For the state of South Carolina, this staff can now point to that because they sent Cam Smith and Zacch Pickens and Darius Rush off to the NFL. And here's the other thing to note about this particular group. 2 out of these 3 guys in particular were defensive backs. So guess what? Torrian Gray, South Carolina's defensive backs coach, he now has additional recruiting ammo that he can utilize on the recruiting trail. He didn't bring in either of these guys, but Cam Smith was turned to one of the best cornerbacks in the SEC because of Torrian Gray. Darius Rush, I don't think anyone, with all due respect, a couple years ago would have believed that Darius Rush would have been a future NFL draft pick. Darius Rush had sort of been floundering around at the wide receiver defensive back position. Was not, of course, his fault. The previous staff, they knew that he had untapped potential, but it's obvious that Will Muschamp and the staff did not fully know exactly where Darius Rush belonged on the roster. They moved him to defensive back in 2020. Then, of course, they all ended up leaving. So then Torrian Gray comes in 2021, and he makes Darius Rush a 5th-round draft pick and one of the best senior defensive backs in college football in his final year here at South Carolina. And that's added on to what he did in 2021, because Torrian Gray helped Assumption College transfer Carlos Patel get an invite to multiple mini camps, and he eventually landed, I believe, with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And he turned walk-on safety Jalen Foster into an All-American. So Torrian Gray just keeps adding on to the resume that he has as a defensive backs coach in college football, and therefore more and more bullet points to point to with these prospects. Guys like 2024 defensive backs Cam Michael and Malcolm Ziegler. 2025 guys that South Carolina is heavily in the game for, like Jordan Young, Ivan Taylor, and Jonte Gilbert, Ohio State commit. He can go to each of these guys' households when he's talking to them and their parents, and he can pull all this stuff out and say, look at what I'm doing with these guys. And these are not my guys. I want you guys to be my first sort of, I guess, true defensive back classes, to where I can really mold y'all from the first day that you step foot on campus. This NFL draft class, sure, there wasn't maybe a 1st-round draft pick, and, you know, a couple of these guys got selected on day 3, which does not matter at the end of the day in the grand scheme of things, because it's awesome that all of these guys are going to get to realize their dreams of going to the NFL in general. But you have 3 South Carolina natives that are moving on to the NFL. You have 2 defensive backs drafted in the first 5 rounds, one of them being a 2nd-round draft pick in Cam Smith. That helps out your coaching staff a lot. That is less negative recruiting that can be thrown at you or used against you by other coaching staffs. So now, if Shane Beamer and his staff can continue to stack up these wins that they are getting on the development side of things to go along with how they have their culture installed and the relationships they build with these guys, the sky is the limit for South Carolina on the gridiron for the next several years to come. All right, now to cap off today's show, let's talk about a great feel-good story that is developing here for Shane Beamer and South Carolina's football program, as it was reported late on Sunday night, originally by Gamecock Central's Chris Clark, that former defensive tackle Travian Robertson could be returning to South Carolina as their new defensive tackles coach. Now, for some of y'all who are hearing this for the first time, you might be sitting here wondering, wait a second, what happened to Jimmy Lindsey? Well, Jimmy Lindsey got hired by the LSU Tigers this past Friday, and during the same day, I made a short reaction video to the loss of Jimmy Lindsey, and I'm not going to talk about that too much on this show. I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of recruiting in the end, but we're going to talk about what Travian Robertson is going to bring to South Carolina and why this is such a good fit for the Gamecocks. First of all, the ties here are quite clear and obvious. Robertson played at South Carolina from 2007 to 2011. He was a standout on the interior defensive line for the Gamecocks, and in his final year here in Columbia, he was a team captain on the defensive side of the ball, which goes to tell you just how much his teammates clearly loved him. Shane Beamer has a strong connection here to Robertson because Shane Beamer, of course, was an assistant from 2007 to 2010 on South Carolina's staff, and during that span, at different points, he coached the outside linebackers, the cornerbacks, and the safeties, which means that Shane Beamer probably interacted a lot with Travian Robertson and got to see how he operates as a person and as a football player on and off the field. So, it's pretty good when your head coach has that great of an idea of what kind of person you are getting here, like Travian Robertson for South Carolina. Here's another thing that we have to keep in mind with this potential hire here. Travian Robertson has NFL experience to point to. Robertson played in the NFL for 3 seasons from 2012 through 2014. So Travian Robertson, therefore, understands what it means to get to the NFL, what's required of you to make it there, and then what you have to do in order to keep a spot on a roster for at least a couple of years. And in my opinion, we need to discuss this facet of the hire just as much as we do the connections that South Carolina has here with Travian Robertson, because Shane Beamer, it's very clear, there are certain traits that he values a lot with his on-field assistant coaches, and one of those traits is NFL experience. It's not the end-all be-all if you don't have NFL experience, but 6 of South Carolina's current on-field assistant coaches have either played in the NFL or coached in the NFL at some point in time in their football career. Travian Robertson would make it 7 on-field assistant coaches. Professional development, being able to use that as a tool on the recruiting trail. It is something that Shane Beamer values a lot, and South Carolina is getting that with Travian Robertson. Now, the other question that some people might ask about this hire is, okay, well, Andrew, what about the recruiting side of things? How's this going to affect South Carolina? How good of a recruiter is Travian Robertson? And the answer to the latter portion of that question would be, we can't really judge Travian Robertson yet as a recruiter. There's not enough of a true sample size to know just how good he can be. But I think that Travian Robertson is going to do just fine on the trail for South Carolina and potentially excel for a couple reasons. First of all, Travian Robertson is a native of North Carolina, hailing from Laurinburg. South Carolina, as we've talked about on this show before, they have struggled a lot in recent years to get some of the top talent out of the state of North Carolina, and a big reason for that is because of Mack Brown's presence back in North Carolina. It's because of Mack Brown's presence at North Carolina. Mack Brown, however, is getting a little bit older. North Carolina has not been able to do enough with the talent that they've gotten, and the door is slowly but surely starting to crack open, and it looks like South Carolina could really get things started in 2024 with Jonathan Paylor, and then 2025, they could have a chance to kick that door down. Travian Robertson could be the guy that leads the charge in that aspect because he hails from that state. So no doubt he is going to have connections to different high schools in the state of North Carolina. Here's the other thing. Robertson is now going to have SEC resources at his disposal. Before he came to South Carolina, or before his potential hire here at South Carolina, he was at Georgia State, Albany State, and is currently with the Tulane Green Wave. Obviously, those are either Group of 5 teams or non-FBS programs. So, he's now going to have, again, much better resources to work with, and Travian Robertson's coaching at his alma mater. He knows his program like the back of his hand. He is not going to have any issue making pitches to prospects of why they should come to South Carolina. That is not going to be a problem for Travian Robertson. Now, in terms of the loss of Jimmy Lindsey, going back to that for just a second, the thing that I sort of really talked about the most in my short reaction clip from late last week was the recruiting side of things, because Jimmy Lindsey had really started to get hot on the recruiting trail for South Carolina, starting with this past cycle. He landed guys like Xavier McLeod and Elijah Davis. But the thing that we really need to look at in terms of a potential hire of Travian Robertson is, how does he handle guys in future recruiting classes? In 2024, Jimmy Lindsey was the primary target for Jordan Thomas, a guy we talked about just last week on this show, a guy that could be a significant interior defensive line target out of the state of New Jersey. So Travian Robertson is going to have to make sure that he makes contact with Jordan Thomas as soon as he possibly can. But the biggest thing to watch in terms of recruiting is the 2025 class, because South Carolina has 3 big-time interior defensive line prospects for that cycle that Jimmy Lindsey was the primary recruiter for. That starts with Elijah Griffin out of Savannah, Georgia, potentially the number 1 prospect in the entire country for that class. On3's industry rankings has him as the #1 prospect. And Jimmy Lindsey was a big reason for that because of the relationship that those two had built together. Travian Robertson is going to have to, again, make sure that he reaches out, and he's now going to have to try to convince Elijah Griffin that, he is just as capable of helping him get to the next level and fulfill all the needs that he has for his future college stop. Amari Adams is another guy that Jimmy Lindsey was the lead recruiter for, hailing from Lake City, South Carolina. Now, Amari Adams, you might have to worry about him as much. It seems like that his relationship more so is with the entire coaching staff and how they all treat him. So the loss of Jimmy Lindsey might not hurt as much in that aspect. And then the last guy is Bryce Jenkins, who hails from Friendship Collegiate Academy and therefore is a teammate of 2024 5-star edge rusher Dylan Stewart. So obviously, for South Carolina, if they can land Dylan Stewart, who's being recruited by Sterling Lucas, not Jimmy Lindsey, so don't freak out in that aspect, then Bryce Jenkins could be a guy that South Carolina can push for in the 2025 cycle. So, needless to say, the Gamecocks are not going to be in any dire straits on the recruiting end. And while, again, the sample size is small, I don't think you have to worry about Robertson as a recruiter. With the ties that he has, the NFL experience that he has, and his ability to probably relate to the younger generation because of his young age, and also be able to make pitches for South Carolina's football program with how well he knows the school, Travian Robertson could indeed be a home run hire for the position that he is going to have on this coaching staff. So again, it is not official yet. There's still some details apparently that need to be worked out, according to Chris Clark from Gamecock Central, but it seems like at this point that it would be a shock if Travian Robertson is not the next defensive tackles coach here at South Carolina. But with that being said, y'all, that is going to do it for today's show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show, as always. What are your thoughts on South Carolina's best prospects for the 2024 NFL draft cycle? What did you think about the message that the Gamecocks sent in terms of developing in-state prospects and developing defensive backs from this current NFL draft cycle? And lastly, what are your thoughts on the Gamecocks potentially bringing home one of their own in Travian Robertson? Let me know your thoughts on all those topics down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube. Or if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app, you can shoot me a direct message on Twitter at @alion_SC. And the Locked On Gamecocks podcast is now on Facebook. So if you're frequently on Facebook, you can feel free to follow our page over there as well. Again, thank y'all so much for tuning into today's show. Have a great rest of your Monday and a fantastic start to the work week. And I'll catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.